What's up, Dinger Nation? Welcome to another exciting conversation on the Bible Dingers YouTube channel. And today we have a very special guest, Detective J. Warner Wallace. How are you doing, my friend?
Doing well. I'm glad to be with you again. That was fun last time. We'll do it again.
Awesome. So, listen, I wanted to have you on because I read Cold Case Christianity. I
hmm
loved it. I
Good.
loved the entire idea of the book, how its approach and how it came to apologetics and the question of Jesus. And so when I saw that person of interest came out, I really wanted to have you on the show again. And I was thinking to myself, before we scheduled this and I had you on,
Yeah.
do I think I can finish reading this book before our scheduled interview? And so I was kind of, in the middle. I didn't think I'd be able to finish it. And so I was thinking, okay, maybe I can get the gist of the book and try and act as if I read it. But then knowing the fact that you're a cold case detective, I was like, man, he's going to be on to me the entire time. He's going to know. And so, pure transparency, I haven't read it yet, but I can't wait to read it. I do know the premise of it, and it sounds really interesting to me. But for the audience, for people who have yet to hear the premise of the book, can you sort of give us a general overview of the book?
Yeah. Well, and don't feel bad about that because there's like two uh, uh, views on doing interviews like this, right? And one view is, oh yeah, you got to read the whole book and you kind of parse out your questions. But a friend of mine, you know Greg Kokel from Stand to Reason,
Mm-hmm.
his view is just the opposite. He's done it both ways. He's been an interviewer for years. He's had a radio show for years, and he kind of likes the idea of, hey, you know what? I've got a rough idea what the book is. Let me ask as a curious kind of outsider. You actually get better. He thinks you get better interviews this way. So there's kind of two schools of thought on this. So no worries either way. But the premise of the book here is, I wrote a book called Cold Case Christianity, where I was looking at like what is inside the crime scene of the New Testament related to Jesus. What do these witnesses, alleged witnesses, say? Should we even accept them as witnesses? Should we trust anything they have to say on the pages of the New Testament, in the Gospels? So all of the evidence from the Gospels I examined in that book. But when I first became a Christian, I was looking at two lines of evidence. One was the stuff that Christians say describes Jesus, the stuff that's I call in the crime scene of the New Testament. But anytime you work a case, especially a cold case, and it went cold for a reason, whatever the first detectives did, it wasn't sufficient to get a filing. So I'm always looking at stuff. I will re-examine for sure the stuff that's in the crime scene, but I'm also going to look at all the stuff that's outside the crime scene, that maybe there's a domino that fell outside the crime scene because of something that happened in the crime scene. And I just need to know that domino will be part of a larger cumulative case, and I'll get this thing filed and get this thing prosecuted. So cold cases involve all those areas, stuff that you might think is not even important. So what we did with this book is we said, okay, if you had a no body murder, that's a murder where a guy gets rid of his wife or a business partner or whatever and says they had an argument and this person ran off. But in reality, they killed the person and they buried the body in such a way that nobody ever finds the body. And so there's no crime scene reported. There is no crime scene ever examined. Then no pictures are taken. They take a missing persons report. No one works it. They're well behind the murder by the time anyone ever takes a serious look at it. By the time I get it 30 years later, there's not a single picture from a crime scene.
Mm.
No body murders are a pain. And a lot of DAs don't want to file them because you got to prove to the jury that, number one, a murder occurred, because
Mm.
maybe they just ran off. And then you got to prove that he's the one who did the murder. So there's two levels that a lot of DAs are like, I'm not interested in taking a case like that. But I've done a number of those. And you tell the jury, look, I'm going to show you what happened on the day of the murder, because I think it was a murder. And if it's not just this person ran off, but it's instead this person was murdered by this suspect, well, that's an explosive day. But every bomb is preceded by a long fuse that burns up to the explosion. And after the explosion occurs, you've got shrapnel and debris all over the blast radius. So I'm going to demonstrate what happened on that day, not because I have any pictures from that day. I don't. But I know the fuse and I know the fallout. And the fuse and the fallout will tell you what happened on the day of the detonation. And that's what we do. We make a case from the fuse and the fallout. So what we did for Jesus, we said, look, if just imagine a thought experiment where every New Testament had been utterly destroyed. Well, what would you know from the fuse and fallout of history that would help you reconstruct what happened in the first century? Because it turns out it's not just that Jesus had tremendous impact or that history aligned to the first century for his arrival. It's that from the impact of Jesus, you can get all the data of the Jesus story and you can reassemble it. That's pretty remarkable considering you could not probably do that for, well, I know for a fact you can't do that for any other living human being in history. Go to that year in which that person was born, look at the fuse burning up to that year and the fallout that fell behind that year, and make a case for the existence of that person and reconstruct all the details of that person's life. Good luck with that. And that's what you can do with Jesus. And the kind of impact he's had compared to any other living human being is remarkable. And that's what we talk about in this book. And it's really kind of, as I was writing about halfway through, I realized this really isn't a book about the evidence for Jesus, although it is. It's really a book about why Jesus still matters. Because everything that you might think matters in life as an atheist, if it's art or literature or music or education or science, whatever it is, it's standing on the shoulders of Jesus. You just don't realize it yet. And as I show you, hopefully you'll say, well, he's worth looking at. And then you'll go back and get a Bible and see what the New Testament does have to say about Jesus.
That's awesome. I wanted to ask you a little bit more of the fuse and fallout, um, just so I can totally understand it. So, what would that look like in the cold case world? Like in a murder case, what sort of things would be the fuse and what would be the fallout?
So, like the fuse in a cold case disappearance is like, okay, well, so it turns out a year before they started to have these public arguments, and then somebody heard him threaten her, and then he starts to, suddenly he's got this interest in certain kinds of acids, and he borrows a barrel from a friend, and in other words, he's not only you see the rise in tension in the relationship, and you start to see what the motive is going to be because it's starting to become more and more obvious, but also you find yourself seeing him do the things that make him uniquely able to dispose of the body or to do the murder to begin with. Well, yeah, he bought a gun a week before. No one's seen the gun since. I mean, there's lots of things that happen in preparation for a crime that you can point to. And then you also have unique deadlines that people try to meet. If you find out, well, one of the cases I talk about in the book, she's pregnant and he doesn't want the baby and she wants to go tell her parents that she's pregnant. Well, now he's facing a deadline of sorts. If he's going to do the thing he was planning on doing anyway, he might as well do it now because he'll eliminate anyone knowing about a motive that maybe he didn't want to have another kid. So you start to see like deadlines in the fuse. And so that's the stuff you're looking at in a cold case is like, what is it that is developing the reason for the murder? The motive is kind of festering and developing. And then what is he doing in preparation? Sometimes these are spontaneous though, too. So you don't always get that preparation piece because sometimes it's just like, I had enough that night and I just decided to, I had one case, for example, where a guy went out and got a big tool out of his garage and came back and beat her to death. So it's not, you don't always have like a preparation side of it, but you often do. And so you can see, I had a case, for example, one time where it was a very nasty divorce and he had figured out a way to avoid paying her, avoid in the divorce, having to give her any of his retirement. And so he had just figured out how to do that. And then sure enough, the day before they were supposed to sell the house, her attorney figured out a way to get all that money back from his, and he got a court order to get, he had just discovered it. Now she's going to end up dead within 6 hours of that discovery. You don't think that's an important part of the fuse leading up to her murder? So it's, that's the kind of stuff you're looking for in a fuse. Now in the fallout, you're usually looking for behavior that either exposes your state of mind before. So for example, oh, I'm just going to move in my, the girlfriend. I happen to have a new girlfriend. I happen to move her in the day after my wife goes disappearing. Yeah, well, really? Or I take and destroy all of her stuff, Oh, I decided to get rid of it all. Well, how do you know she's okay? Look, she just left. She could come back tomorrow. Why would you get rid of her stuff? Unless, of course, you realize she's never coming back. So there's lots of stuff you might do on the backside that will give away the fact that you're responsible for her disappearance. And that's the kind of stuff that, we're looking at in the fallout.
I see. I can kind of picture the fallout portion for Jesus. I can see, okay, people were converted, churches were started, but I'm interested in what some of the fuse portion would be for Jesus' existence.
So if you look at the question and kind of ask it this way, why, if God is going to come into the world, why come into the world then? Why not come in now when technology is better, when I can communicate the message of Jesus better? Well, I think there's a number of reasons why he wouldn't come now, but I think one of the most important issues related to why he comes in the first century is by tracing the fuse of history to see what is happening in the first century that is so unique to the first century and provides a window of opportunity in the first century. So for example, in crimes, you kind of look at and say, well, when did he have all the things that he needed to kill her? What was the deadline? You get this window of opportunity in which he's going to act right. If I had to guess, he's going to act right here because this window of opportunity is small, and of course that's when she goes missing. And so there you go. That's that demonstrates when he does it is actually another evidence for him having done it, because it turns out everyone's window of opportunity is different. His is unique. If she happens to disappear in his unique window of opportunity, he might be a candidate. So a lot of it is trying to figure out what I call is the red zone of opportunity. And you see these happening on three different kinds of fuse that lead up to the first century. One's a cultural fuse, the Roman Empire. It's the rise and fall of empires, and all of the infrastructure that each empire brings into place. Roads get better, postal services get better, communication services get better, alphabets are developed, papyrus is actually formed as a technology, as a tool to write on. A lot of opportunities start to align in the first century. So, for example, it turns out that the Roman Empire has a huge role to play in why Christianity explodes across the planet the way it does, because it appears in an empire that controls the entire region around where the densest population, except for the Far East. So if you look at, for example, how much territory Egypt occupied when the Egyptian Empire ruled, or the Persian Empire ruled, or the Greek Empire ruled, and compare it to the Roman Empire, and the power of the Roman Empire, and the fact that the Roman Empire had at least a portion, a bit of religious tolerance that would allow a system like Christianity to at least initiate within the Roman Empire, and the fact that roads were now in place, the very roads that Paul used to plant the churches, some of which are mentioned in Revelation, the 7 churches. Those roads were not even available a couple of hundred years before the first century because they hadn't been built and paved or laid down by the Roman Empire. So just the infrastructure, the 200-year period of peace called the Pax Romana, these things provided the fact that they now had the Etruscan alphabet popularized, Koine Greek was popularized. They were writing on papyrus. This thing travels very well compared to, say, for example, clay tablets are usually more brittle. Stone is heavier. So the ability to travel with a message is really aligned into the first century in a way that opens up a window of opportunity. Now, if you overlap that window of opportunity on, for example, the Old Testament prophecies of when the Messiah will come, and I also do the same thing by overlapping all of the mythologies that are being worshipped by other groups, because if you wanted to come and best personify the expectations of ancient people groups who think about God, because there are, in the book, I identify 15 common characteristics of ancient mythologies.
Mm-hmm.
Well, none of those ancient mythologies actually no one ancient myth actually possesses all 15 attributes. But then you get to Jesus and he possesses all 15 attributes. If you wanted to arrive at a time when the most worshipers were worshiping actively gods that had at least some common ancient expectations of deity, these are windows of opportunity. So when you overlap the prophetic window with the cultural window, with the spiritual window, I show in the book in one of the chapters how you get a window of about 100 years that runs from about 29 BC to about 70 AD. And if anyone comes in that window, they can capitalize on those 3 fuses. And that's exactly, of course, when Jesus comes.
That's really interesting. I had no idea that it's
Well,
so intricate.
if you look at it like, Paul talks about this in Galatians 4, that God comes in the form of Jesus in the fullness of time. God sent his son.
Hmm.
So the question is, what does that even mean? Well, that's what we're trying to lock down when we talk about red zone.
Interesting. That is so cool. That is so cool. The intricacies of history that came together, and it seems as if Jesus came at just the right moment. And I
Well,
never really considered it. It's always just like, oh yeah, he came 2,000 years ago.
well,
And
think if he came today. If he came today, um, you're watching social media. I'm watching social media. Do you think we're any more likely to accept? I mean, we are so polarized.
mm,
Everything's become political. Every
mhm,
claim about anything about reality is now somehow politicized. And if you believe it and you're not on the same political aisle I am, I'm not going to believe it.
mm,
So, and not only that, I don't think we believe what our eyes show us. I mean, we're at a point right now where Marvel, I mean, if you're looking for evidence of God on video, I think every Marvel movie, right?
yeah.
I mean, what would you believe in 2020, in 2022? I'm not sure what, if we think that somehow I could convince, what would it take? Well, I got a video of this. Well, if I showed you video of it, would that make you any more certain it really happened? I think we're actually too polarized right now. Not only that, what
Mm,
I learned, and by doing this, is that if you think about, like, you're going to put this on YouTube, right? Okay, I've got a YouTube channel also. And let's say we got 100,000 views on any one particular view of one particular video. That's not 100,000 people downloading it to their hard drive. That's not occupying 100,000 geographic locations. That's being no one downloads anything they watch online, right? They just watch it. And
yeah.
it's pretty easy to flip the switch on those kinds of things. But when you write it on a manuscript 100,000 times, it now occupies 100,000 geographic locations, which means it's much harder to erase. And
Mm,
that's what you'll see in the book. The fallout section, you can actually reconstruct the story of Jesus from sources outside the New Testament because they're going to quote the New Testament. So, for example, in the sciences, we've dominated the sciences. The fathers and founders of every major modern scientific discipline, I mean, very few are not founded by Christ followers. And I have a list in the book of hundreds of scientific disciplines that are founded by Christians, all the way from like modern chemistry all the way to quantum mechanics. And if you look at those people who are the fathers of the sciences, and a lot of them are women, this is a title they use for anyone who, initiates a scientific discipline.
mhm,
Those Christ followers also wrote about Jesus. So from the personal journals, letters, and actually books of the science fathers, you can learn as much information about Jesus as you can from the church fathers. So you'd have to destroy the entire history of the sciences in order to erase the person of Jesus. You can reconstruct his story from the mouths of the science fathers. And they've written enough that we can find that evidence is out there. I actually have a short list of what you can reconstruct, and it's very modest, but you'll see it's as robust as any other list in the book. And I'm only looking at a handful of scientists because it's hard to find the personal journals, right? But you have to kind of go visit the actual archives of each scientist. So if you're not able to do that, you're only going to be able to collect a partial set.
mm,
But it's so robust that it's more than enough to demonstrate the point that the story of Jesus, it can be reconstructed from the history of science. It can be reconstructed from the top 15 campuses of the top 15 universities in the world because we've had that kind of impact on education. It can be reconstructed from the arts and just the artistic movements up to the Dark Ages. It can be reconstructed from literature in the first 300 years of the Common Era. It can be reconstructed from music in the first 300 years of the Common Era. So you're stuck with Jesus, and his story is completely recoverable in a number of weird places in the fallout, including, for example, world religions, because everyone hat tips Jesus. If you're a world religion that was initiated after Jesus, like Islam or even like Ahmadi Muslims or Baha'i or Hare Krishna, well, you've already got Jesus incorporated into your worldview. And if you're a system that came before Jesus, like Buddhism or Hinduism, well, your leaders are talking about Jesus. And from the mouths of your leaders or from the pages of your scripture, we can reconstruct the story of Jesus. And these are from non-Christian religious sources. So that's the kind of impact that Jesus had. Nobody in the history of anybody's has had that kind of impact.
mm. Well, so my next question is, I understand that we can recreate Jesus' existence. Okay, we can prove that it happened based on all these different disciplines, different sources. But who cares? Like, why does that even matter if Jesus existed or not?
Okay, well, a couple of things. Number one, it matters in the sense that I was an atheist till I was 35. The things that mattered to me, because I was in the arts before I became a detective. So I have a bachelor's degree in design and a master's degree in architecture, and then I became a detective, or police officer, and then eventually became a detective. But if you'd asked me what was important, I would have said it was the arts and music and literature and education and science. Those were the things I thought were really the most important aspects of culture and the most important things that civilizations leave for the next civilization. And all of those are dominated by Jesus. If you think those things matter to you, well, go back and take a look at the arts, for example. Every single artist in all the different movements of the arts, the historic movements, like from antiquity all the way to pop art to Dadaism to surrealism, whatever ism there is, take a look at the top three masters, and they're all over the world. And then look at those top three masters, their catalog. You will find that every one of them has something either painted, etched, sculpted, drawn about Jesus of Nazareth. He's that kind of inspirational figure. And that's interesting, right? He
Yeah.
still matters. He matters, and he still matters to artists and to musicians, and he still matters. He's still an inspiration. Sometimes he's a object of scorn, or he's an object of ridicule, but he's not ignored. And as we see even in culture now that is moving further and further from the teaching of Jesus, he will still be of interest to the culture, even if it's only to be mocked or scorned. He does draw a reaction. He matters. Now you might say, well, why does it matter in terms of his? Well, look, if you cannot find another fictional character in the history of fictional characters who has had this kind of impact, and you won't. If you think you've got one, tell me who it is. You won't find a character of fiction who has been more written about than anybody else, more sung about than anybody else, more painted than anybody else, is the foundation of education and the foundation of the sciences, and is in part of every other world religion. You won't find it. So there's good reason to believe that Jesus is something other than a fictional character. And you also won't find that any other living human being has had this kind of impact. So there's good reason to believe he's something other than another living human being. In other words, this kind of impact is part of a cumulative case for the historicity and deity of Jesus, because you're not going to find anybody else historically or from a human perspective who's accomplished and had the kind of influence that Jesus has. And so that's why I would say he still matters, right? Because this is more than just, well, he's had a big impact, but couldn't somebody else have a big impact? It's that, look, if the Gospels claim that Jesus is God, the New Testament claims that Jesus comes and even rises from the dead. Well, how many times have you heard it said, if Jesus really is what he said he was, and if he really did what these Gospels say he did, wouldn't there be some impact? Like, wouldn't you expect that this kind of person would pop into history, and all you're going to have is four little documents from a remote part of the Roman Empire, the Gospels? Like, wouldn't you expect the ripple effect to be huge? Well, congratulations. The ripple effect is huge. Now, it may just be that you haven't been paying attention to it, but it's been there all along. And it's been more obvious to other generations than it is the one we're living in right now. And I think what we're seeing now is that there's an effort afoot to demonstrate how everything that's vile that you see in culture has come from Christianity, when in fact everything that's beautiful has come from Christ. Now, can you take something beautiful and twist it for your own evil purpose? Yeah. When I was an atheist, I thought that the model of evolution was beautiful and it explained a lot. I would have said that evolution is true and that it explains a lot. But don't think for a second that evolution has not been leveraged to form one form of racism or another. It has. So every claim of every worldview can be abused to create something ugly. But nothing has the ability to create something as beautiful as Christianity has created in those areas of art, literature, music, education, science, and other world religions.
So when I was thinking about the impact that it's had on culture and the arts and things, I was wondering if what are your thoughts on maybe that coming from sort of a I don't know how to put it. I don't want to say Eurocentric, but like we have a certain culture growing up in the States, and that was Christian for the most part, at least for my childhood. But what if I grew up in India? Would I feel the same way about the Buddha, that the Buddha has impacted all of arts and culture in my experience, and that this is sort of just a cultural thing?
Okay, so that's a great question. So let's use the example you started with in Buddha. So if you're to remember, I'm looking at all these aspects of culture: art, music, literature, education, science, and world religions, and ask yourself, has Buddha had the impact in these areas that Jesus has? And he had a head start. Remember,
Mm-hmm.
Buddhism is in place long before Jesus comes along. So I would expect him to have even bigger impact. Well, you will not find that impact. You will not find the Buddha, for example, as an inspiration in the arts. As a matter of fact, I use the Buddha as an example in the book. If you look at the Buddha as he's depicted cross-culturally, look at him in South America, look at him in India, look at him in China. Buddha, when Buddha is crafted, looks the same. There's not a lot of variation because, and I'm not sure really why that's the case, except that I can compare it to Jesus. And when you look at Jesus in those same, you'll see completely different cultural renditions. Almost always, Jesus becomes the ethnicity of whatever group is painting or sculpting him.
Mm-hmm.
And whatever art form, he adapts in a way that allows each culture to be creative within its culture and depict Jesus in its own. He's an older sibling, an older brother, right? The firstborn of all creation, the first resurrected. This is people see Jesus as another member of the human family, and they will shape him in a form that resembles their human family. And for that reason, he inspires in a way that does not require a certain conformity of image. And so what I did in the book is show all the different places in the world that people are inspired by in crafting Jesus. And if you look at how different Jesus looks in each country, it's remarkable. Do the same thing with Buddha. Buddha does not look different in each country.
Mm.
So that's something that is one of the reasons why I think that Jesus has had this kind of inspiration, is that he is much more malleable. He is much more adaptable. And in cultures have adapted. So if you're in China and you're painting Jesus, he looks Chinese.
Mm.
Looks very different. You wouldn't know these are the same figures in art if you compare him from, say, South Africa or from someplace in South America to someplace in the Far East, because
Mm.
they look like culturally and not just the stylistically, they are also very different. So it's not just in terms of ethnicity or race, it's in terms of styles. Now, it can be argued, well, look, you're just seeing okay, here's the thing. To say, well, he's only an influence on the West. Okay, what's happened here is that he has such a splash that everywhere that this view touches is become known as Western culture. But what is Western culture? It's just the impact of Jesus, right? Or, of course, you can look back and say, oh, it's European cultures, but they're going to argue at some point they're greatly impacted by Jesus. Let's look at it this way. It's interesting that with the head start that, say, Buddhists had, they are not nearly as impactful in education. Look at do a search for every Buddhist university ever planted, and do a search for every Christian university. Christians are the founders of what we now know as the modern university. There were ancient systems of education, of course, but this idea of a campus that you attend and there's a faculty that serves a resident population of students and awards them with a diploma at the end of a program of study, that it comes out of Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, three universities founded by Christians. So there's so again, if they had a head start, why didn't they have this kind of impact on the sciences? Why didn't they have this kind of impact on education? I don't think you're going to find, and I have a list in the last chapter of the book in which I say, okay, look at everyone else who lived in the first century. Who else had this kind of impact? Nobody. Look
Mm.
at all the other world leaders throughout history. Tell me who's had the impact of Jesus. Nobody. Take a look at all the deities or people who are religious leaders throughout history. Who's had this? You could take all of the Buddhist educational institutions, Jewish educational institutions, uh, Hindu universities, put them all together, multiply by 10, you still are not at how many have been planted by Christians. The impact of Christ followers. Why would this be the case? Well, because Jesus gives us the Great Commission. It's not to go out and make converts. The Great Commission is to go out and make disciples, teaching them everything I have taught. In other words, this whole thing is going to start and stop with teaching. Oh, yeah,
Mm.
but look, I can't teach them because they don't have a language. They don't even read. They can't read the book. They don't have, teach them how to read. Well, they don't have an alphabet. Create an alphabet. The movement of Christian education is driven because of the Great Commission. That Jesus does not just like launch us into the world, say, go for it. No, he says, start a teaching culture as people of the book. You're going to teach everybody what I taught you, and you're going to make disciples. That's a teaching process. And that initiation of that kind of worldview ends up changing the world. And then on the back side of that, we say, well, that's just Western culture. Well, that just turns out to what the world looks like after Jesus arrives.
I kind of want to switch gears here, but I do got to say that you're kind of blowing my mind a little bit, and I'm really excited to read the book now.
Well, you should have read the book, man. Come on. No,
I
I'm
should
only
have.
kidding.
I know.
I'm only
Big
kidding.
whoops. Big whoops.
No problem.
So I was gonna ask, most of the evidence that I know of to prove Jesus's existence comes from the New Testament documents. We've had Dr. Gary Habermas on the show,
Yep.
amazing man. And that's really the only case that that's the only case for Jesus that I'm familiar with. And I've always been interested in sort of the extra biblical resources that are out there. And I know is that most of what you used, or is that all of what you used in your book?
Okay, well, I would go back and agree with you on this. The only thing you can know about Jesus, it must be known from the New Testament Gospels. So the most ancient information we have about Jesus comes out of the Gospel authors. So what this case does is it does not ignore that. As a matter of fact, it's utterly dependent on that, because what I'm saying is that as you would expect, if Jesus is who he said he is, everything that follows, people are constantly repeating the Gospels, so that even if you destroyed the Gospels, you'd be stuck with the content of the Gospels, recoverable in all of those aspects of culture I told you about. They're all recoverable. The story of Jesus is recoverable by simply looking at the buildings and campuses of the top 15 universities. Why? Because they were founded by Christ followers, and their first buildings had pictures of Jesus, etchings, verses. I mean, if you just go back and look at the most ancient, show me your oldest buildings, please. Well, you can go there and show me your charter. You're going to get a lot of information about Christianity and about Jesus from just the charters and structures of campuses. But again, it's only pointing back to the data that's in the New Testament, right? Let's put it this way. Do you honestly think, given all the impact that Jesus has had and how deeply his story can be reconstructed, that if the Gospels never reported a miracle worker, in other words, if all the Gospels reported was that Jesus was a smart guy and did some sermons, but never worked a miracle, never born of a virgin, never rose from the grave, never walked on water, just a smart guy who said a lot of neat things, do you think anyone would doubt the historicity or existence of Jesus of Nazareth, given the manuscript evidence and the impact of that manuscript evidence across history? No, I think you still have questions. How can a regular guy who never worked a miracle have this kind of impact? I think in the end, it would make no sense at all. But I would say that most people are doubting the historicity of Jesus, not based on how much manuscript evidence we have, but based on their presuppositional bias against the miraculous. Because a non-miraculous Jesus, I think, would be as historic. Nobody's been as well recorded and as well documented throughout history as Jesus of Nazareth. But here's the problem: there's miracles in there, so therefore it can't be true. It's got to be just the propagation of a lie, because there's no way. That comes down to a bias against something other than the manuscript evidence. It's a bias against the contents of the Gospels, because you don't like anything supernatural.
So I did want to. So the New Testament is the basis of
Yep.
the whole idea and really the importance of the book. But from what I understand, you used a lot of arguments when it comes to the fallout using extra biblical sources. Is that correct?
Okay, so now when you say extra biblical, what I mean is that okay, in the literature chapter, okay, you'll find that there are the first 300 years there are lots of non-biblical sources. Not all of them are non-Christian sources. Some are, some aren't. in which ancient voices are saying something about Jesus and ultimately recorded on some manuscript that's not in your New Testament canon. Okay. So you will see some of that. There's a whole chapter on that. Okay. But what I'm doing with this book, and by the way, I talk about that quite a bit also in Cold Case Christianity. So this is the first place I've actually looked at some of the non-Christian sources that we might look at. I also did that in Forensic Faith, where you can take a look and say, well, what are the earliest non-Christian sources repeat? And much of what they repeat, by the way, is more about Christians than it is about Jesus of Nazareth anyway. All right.
Mm.
But again, when we say, hey, there's got to be I need better non-Christian, non-biblical information about Jesus. Well, what you're really saying is you don't trust that the biblical information is true. Right. But the question I have is, why, if you could test the biblical information and it passes the test of a reliable eyewitness testimony, why would you kick that to the curb? Well, because they're Christians. Well, yeah, but Matthew didn't start off as a Christian, a Christ follower. He ends up as a Christ follower. Remember, Matthew is picked up on the road as a tax collector. Okay,
Mm.
he's not like part of the discipleship of John the Baptist. Everyone's looking for a Messiah, and here comes my cousin. He's the Messiah. Okay, we'll just go follow him. That's not Matthew. Matthew's a dude who's not, no one even likes Matthew. Okay. And he ends up in the group and he becomes a Christian. And then he writes a gospel about Jesus. Now you're saying you can't even count that? Well, look,
Mm.
if you saw what Matthew saw, you'd be convinced too.
Mm.
So what are you going to do? I mean, you're going to like, okay, but if you're looking for the guy who's not part of the club, who ends up writing about Jesus, that's called the Gospel of Matthew. And I think you have to kind of accept the fact that again, it's all going to come down. I think personally, I don't think anyone would doubt Matthew's account of Jesus. They wouldn't say, "Oh, I need an extra account now," except that it's got miracles in it, and therefore we can't trust it.
I think besides that as well, I think people may have an issue with Christian sources because they would say that there's a presuppositional bias there. Like they want this information to be true because they're Christians. And so isn't there sort of a need for non-Christian sources because that does away with the bias that would be present in the text?
Well, okay, so this is how I described it in Cold Case. I had a case one time with a robbery in which a bank robbery occurs, and a guy walks in to do the bank robbery, doesn't realize that the lady behind the assistant manager's desk is somebody he went to high school with. We'll just call her Kathy for the sake of argument. Okay. So Kathy sees this dude and she's like, oh, I want to say hello to him. I haven't seen him in a couple of years. But before she can say hello, he's now at the counter and he's doing an armed robbery. He's doing a demand note robbery. It's very subtle. You show a demand note, you show a gun, you put those back in your pocket. And now this teller starts to, so you couldn't even tell it was a robbery when he was at the counter. But the lady at the counter has a signal and she looks over at Kathy and she gives her the signal. And now Kathy knows there's a robbery in progress. And she's shocked because this is a guy that she knew from high school and she would never in a million years have thought of him as a bank robber. As a matter of fact, everything about this guy was just the opposite. So she's shocked. But now, based on what she's seen, she's convinced he's a bank robber because it's happening right in front of her eyes. Now, can I interview her? No, she's biased. I mean, she thinks that this dude's a bank robber. This guy's name is Robert Smith. She's now a Robert Smithian. She thinks that Robert Smith is a bank robber. You can't ask Robert Smithians about Robert Smith. No, hold on a minute. That's stupid. She's not convinced on a basis of bias. She's convinced on the basis of observation. So like Matthew, you cannot say, well, I got to kick Matthew to the curb because he's a Christian and he wants it to be true. No, she didn't want it to be true. She just saw it. There's no evidence that Matthew is even interested in a Messiah. Read the text. But he's in because he saw it. And now you're in. So I just think we got to be careful about who we decide we're going to listen to. Okay, if I had 10 people who saw Jesus and they all like, hey, I'm not looking for, I'm not even Jewish when I started, but now here he is. So I'm going to write about him. Well, I can't trust your information. Yeah, but I didn't start off believing in this guy. I just ended up believing in the guy. So again, I think if anyone who sees this, who was there for that period of time, is going to have the same result, right? And so there it becomes a matter of, well, if you say, hey, well, there's a gospel of Judas. Well, if there really was a gospel of Judas, but he saw it too. I suspect if he's going to write about Jesus, he's going to write about him as the same Son of God that everybody else is describing. Because anyone who sees this guy is going to end up reporting it this way. Now, as soon as the word gets out, you're going to have other people reporting that these people are reporting this, but you're not going to count that. You're going to say, well, no, but they're not really eyewitnesses. They're just listening to what the Christians are saying. Well, okay, look, but if you saw it, you'd be in that other group. You'd be in the Christian group. So now you're saying you cannot trust the Christian group. But when the Christian starts to tell somebody else, you're like, well, I can't trust them because they're not in the Christian group. Okay, well, now you just created a conundrum that nobody can solve because you don't want it to be true.
That's interesting. Yeah, it's a no-win situation because you
Yeah.
won't allow for anybody to be trustworthy.
Right. Is it possible
Interesting.
somebody could be in that group who could say, I'm not really, look, there's no evidence that Mark, right, he's not an eyewitness. Okay. There's no evidence that Mark's even part of the original group, but he is somebody who we see in the book of Acts. And at some point he's listening to Peter and Peter is making claims. But you could argue, and I think it's fair to argue that, look, I'm arguing that Peter is part of that group with John the Baptist. And so maybe there's some bias there. They're all hoping for a Messiah. But this cannot be said of Matthew. You could say it of Peter. You could say it of John. But you're not going to be able to say it of Matthew.
Interesting. So I kind of want to know why you decided to write not only this book, but apologetics books in general. It seems like you had a good gig going as a detective. So what made you want to get into this?
Well, I got saved as a 35-year-old and doing the same stuff I've reported in these books. This is my process. It's really a combination. For me, it was a combination of cold case Christianity, God's crime scene, and person of interest. Those three things for me happen simultaneously. And so each investigation during 3 different books, but for me, it all happened in the same 9-month period of time. So that was my process. And then once I became a Christian, I wanted to learn as much as I could. So I ended up in seminary at some point. And then, my kids were in church and I ended up volunteering and serving as a youth pastor and teaching students. But at some point I'm teaching students the way that I became a Christian. I'm just showing them the evidence. So it's like all you could say is all apologetics. I never really thought of it as apologetics. I just thought of it as I need to show these guys and gals why this is true. So it just became an exercise in constantly showing my group why this is true. And as I was doing that, we would start to take trips to make the case. Then we would take trips like to Berkeley, where we spend a week at UC Berkeley because it's a very hostile environment. Not hostile so much as apathetic, probably a little bit hostile, but more apathetic probably than anything else. And so it was a good place for our students to learn how to defend what they believed before they got there or to a school like that, because I'm in the California system here. So I started taking students up there and I was working with somebody, Brett Kunkel, who's got maventruth.com. He's great. He's the only one I know of now who continues to do those immersive trips because I'm not doing them anymore. But he continues to do them, and he's doing a bunch every year. So if you're interested in that kind of thing for your church group, please go to maventruth.com. But we kind of developed that first trip together, and we took several. And then Sean McDowell, Josh McDowell's son, was interested because he's a high school teacher. So we started taking him with him. And one of these trips, I was up with his group, and I was teaching them from the content in cold case Christianity. Didn't have a book at that time. And he said, hey, why don't you write a book about this? And I had 3 cases in trial at the same time. There's no way I had time to do this. But my wife said, oh, might as well put together an outline. Well, that ultimately became cold case Christianity. So I just kind of fell into it. And it was not really so much I knew anything about writing books as much as I just knew what my process was. And I just kind of traced it in cold case. That's the stuff that I did from inside the New Testament. But all the other stuff, it was important to me. It wasn't so much that I needed to assemble a better, like I didn't trust the New Testament, but that wasn't so much it as the question I talked about earlier, which is really, I just don't understand. Wouldn't you expect if God enters into his creation, there'd be this huge ripple effect? And I just wanted to see, is that the case? Did he have that kind of ripple effect? So yes, there are going to be some claims in the New Testament. I'll be testing those. But I mean, if someone said, I got this remarkable thing, but there's only 10 people who know about it. Well, you're probably going to go, really? This is supposed to be God? You're talking about God, and you're telling me there's a group right now of 10 of us who know this so far? Well, yeah, although there are millions who know this, but my point is, wouldn't there be this huge, huge impact, this crater from where he strikes? And that's what I was looking to see, if that actually was the case. And so that makes more sense. given that this is a nobody. Okay, this is a dude who's got nothing you would think would lead him to have influence. He doesn't have royal heritage. He is not of an important family. He does not have money. He's not born in an important town. He's not raised in an important town. He's not part of a group that was considered to be all that important at the time within that region. Not that region, within that empire. And he didn't have all the trappings of, like, a really good family that could give you this great education, and all the monarchs, and all the nobility, and the emperor, and all the governors. No, none of that power. No kids, no family, no platform of all. No Twitter, no Facebook, no TikTok, right? None of that stuff. And also, he doesn't have any, doesn't rule a nation. He's not ruling an army. He's not a general. He's not a writer. He's not writing books. This is a dude who's got zero. Okay, he's been hunted by the people who are powerful and persecuted by the people who are religious, and the people who said they loved him and they were his followers basically denied him and betrayed him. And then he ends up being falsely accused and brutally killed, and then they got to borrow a grave for this dude. So that's the guy we're talking about still, all these years later. That's the guy who has the impact on art, literature, music, education, science, and every other world religion like no other person who's ever lived. Okay, that to me makes no sense at all. Unless, of course, he's everything the New Testament says he is. So I was doing both of these. And, I didn't think I'd do another Jesus book, to be honest with you. I thought, who's going to care about this? Enough already. I've already talked about Jesus for 10 years, right? So I thought I would do another, I did a book on Jesus, a book on God, a book on faith. And I thought, well, that's a good trilogy. But when it came to Zondervan, they wanted to tease out the rest of it. And so I really think that I'd love to at some point write fiction, true crime fiction, right? Because I just love crime stories, and I think I could be wrong, but I have a feeling like I kind of know that world pretty well. And no, I mean, everyone's is different, though. I could be wrong about that. But I certainly did enough cases where I think I know something about that world, and so I just think I would like to do that sometime. Also, what I love about fiction is you're invisible as a writer. One of the hard things about writing nonfiction or making a case for something is then people want you to talk about it. Like here we are, right? We're talking about the impact of Jesus on culture. If I wrote a fictional book, I mean, maybe fictional authors get interviewed occasionally, but it's not like this, right? Where you're continuing to make a public case for something you made a written case about. Fiction is either good or it's bad. People like it or they don't like it. And you can be, if I told you, for example, you pick the best, movies that are out there and they're based on novels. And if I mention the authors and ask you to identify them in a lineup, you probably couldn't even do it because you might know their names, but you don't know what they look like. And I kind of like in a social media world where everything is based on celebrity and authority and all that stuff. Wouldn't it be nice just to be able to be creative and do what you love to do, which is right, and have nobody know what you look like, and nobody really want to talk to you. They just want to read your stuff. And that to me, like, that's the dream. So that's where I'm trying to eventually head in that direction.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I was thinking to myself, what we do on our show is like 80% theology, maybe 20% apologetics. But every time we deal with apologetics, we get just a band of people beating us up in the comments, angry about it.
Right.
And you live in that world. I mean, you live in the apologetics world. So how do you deal with that? Are people constantly on you all the time, yelling at you, saying you're wrong about this, that, and the other thing?
Well, there's no doubt that you're going to encounter, if you're on social media at all, social media is really just a bunch of people who are hammers looking for nails. And so you're going to have to, deal with that. And if you're going to make a case affirmatively for Christianity, it's one thing when you're talking to other Christians about theological issues we might not understand well or we disagree about, because then your audience is just Christians versus Christians. Or people who say, claim Christ as their identity, or they're following Christ as in the same group making the comments. But when you're doing apologetics, you're largely going to have both sides, the atheists who don't like the fact you're making a case and the Christians who do. So you're going to have a lot of hostility, and you have to figure out how. Look, I'm not a nonprofit. I don't run a nonprofit. I don't consider myself in my career. I have a pension. as a detective. And I really, it'd be nice to live a quiet life the way that Scripture asks us to do, tells us to live this quiet life. And I'd like to do that, but it's hard, right? When you're writing books and social media is the way in which we tell the world about our books. So you end up in this social media sphere, but I keep it in its place, right? I'm a private citizen, a retired detective, and I try to keep the main things the main things. And the main things are my family.
Hmm.
So I don't spend a lot of time. I don't, I proclaim Jesus as a spiritual discipline. The same way that if you're a Christian, you think, well, some part of my life needs to be in prayer. Some part of my life needs to be in Bible reading. Some part of your life needs to be in the proclamation of who Jesus is to others. It's like a spiritual discipline for me. I just keep on chugging along in those spiritual disciplines, but I'm not goal oriented about this. So the goal is not to become the guy or to become the book. It's just, I write about Jesus. So I continue to do that. And some people are going to respond favorably. Some people are not. And I just don't ramp up the hostility. I feel like on social media platforms, I feel like, I want to moderate an environment where people that reflect the nature of Jesus, even in the comment section. And I know that probably inhibits our algorithms. It does all the things that you're not supposed to do if you're trying to get a big audience, but that's not the goal. The goal is that I want people to come to our channel, for example, and when they are there, not to be somebody else's nail, right? And I happened to say something nice about this, and before I know it, I had 10 people who want me dead, So I think so part of it is how do you kind of moderate that kind of place? Is that the role? I think it is part of our role is to help moderate an environment that is Christ-like if we're going to be proclaiming the message of Jesus. So that means that for a lot of time, I'm not going to probably engage in hostility, right? I don't think I don't think it's becoming. And I try to just keep the main things. It's reliability of Scripture. Does God exist? That's enough. That draws enough fire, right? People will that'll be enough for people to want to attack just because you're making that case. But also, a lot of it is, think about this for a second. I mean, I've got a family, even though I'm an old guy. And I'm going to spend that's the stuff that matters. It's the one place all of us are irreplaceable. Think about this. I mean, for the most part, if we don't do this YouTube channel, somebody else is going to come along after us and they'll replace us. We're not irreplaceable on YouTube. We're not irreplaceable in the field of apologetics books, but we are irreplaceable to our families. And so I try to keep the main things, right? We do this because I feel like God has called me to say something about him. But I don't think, as a private citizen who does not run a 501c3, I'm not really trying to build something with this. Right. That's the other thing too, is look, be honest. What we see a lot is we gotta be careful that I don't want to build a big, sometimes you get in this bad place where you're like, oh, I want to build this big platform, this big social media platform so I can preach Jesus. Well, then I see it. Sometimes we're not careful. It flips. And now you're just preaching Jesus to build the social media platform. I never want to get to that place. So I just, just be faithful, produce the content, keep on talking about Jesus, be faithful in describing Jesus as accurately as you can to as many people who will listen, and just don't get caught up in the social media persona.
That's awesome. And I really enjoyed our conversation today. You opened my eyes to a lot of things that I didn't know about before, and I'm really excited to read the book. And for any other viewers who are interested in some of your work, where can they go to learn more about you?
Well, our website, we had for years a website called pleaseconvinceme.com. That was before I ever knew, anything about websites. I just was, putting our content there. Now it's called coldcasechristianity.com, coldcasechristianity.com. And that's where we post 3 times a week, an article, a podcast, and a video every week. And that hopefully it'll help you be able to make the foundational case, right? Because all the stuff that we're talking about that shakes out in culture, whatever it is you believe about the hot topics in culture, it's grounded on your worldview. And as Christians, that means it's grounded on whether we believe Christianity is true and whether we believe the Bible is reliable. So I try to stay there, and rather than get downstream on all the hot topic issues, But I do know there's a ton of great resources, even on social media, even on YouTube, for the kind of cultural hot topics. But what we try to do at Cold Case Christianity is make the case for the foundational issues.
One last thing
Yeah.
before I let you go is I wanted to mention about your website that I had heard the objection to Christianity so many times that Jesus was a ripoff of Horus and all these other deities from other religions. And I've found that your content on this topic is so good. It's so full and easy to understand. And it's probably my favorite resource on this topic. I really appreciate the work that you've done in that territory.
Well, I appreciate that's one of the chapters now. We really fleshed it out in this chapter of the book on the spiritual fuse that's burning, because I think it's always kind of pitched, like you said, that the similarities between ancient mythologies and Jesus invalidate Jesus, when in fact, I think it's just the opposite. They're not that similar, but there are broad expectations that ancients had about God that end up in their mythologies. And those broad expectations are reasonable if we as humans are created in the image of the God who created us. Then don't be surprised that you are sometimes thinking about him, and that you as a creative yourself, because you're in the image of the creator, will create things in your own mind that Paul recognized when he was on Mars Hill. And he said, you people are very religious. Well, no kidding. You think about God a lot. You got a lot of stuff wrong. We saw God. We saw him resurrect from the dead. Let me tell you about him. Well, that approach basically leverages all of the things that the ancients had been thinking about God, but had been off the mark. So it turns out that the ancient mythologies are ancient people groups thinking about God, but being off the mark. As C.S. Lewis says, they're the myths from the minds of poets in antiquity, whereas Jesus is the myth from the mind of God based in what we call real things. And that is the difference, is that Jesus comes and meets the expectations of the ancients in a way that catalyzes the growth of Christianity, even in the first century.
I really appreciated this conversation. Really fascinated by the book. I can't wait to read it. Thank you so much for being on the show, my friend.
Thanks for having me, brother. I appreciate you.